Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrew Stott and I'm the Emperor of Stomaria. Today I want to discuss self-sufficiency and how it ties into the question of sovereignty. Now, for my part, I've argued for some years that the concept of a sovereign state is something of an illusion and it's not as definitive as a lot of people seem to think. So if you look at the definition of a sovereign state, it's a state within a defined territory that administers its own government and is not subject to or dependent on another power. Now, if you start to dissect this definition, you can see that there are actually very few sovereign states in the world today. So if we look at the first criteria, in order to define something as a sovereign state, it needs to have a defined territory. Fine, pretty straightforward, pretty simple stuff. And it also needs to have its own government. Again, very straightforward, very simple stuff. And even if you take into account the numerous fractured governments and civil wars and territorial disputes that go on around the world at any given time, you can still get your head around the idea that these are things that make a state sovereign. But to not be subjected to or dependent on another power, well, that is where it gets a lot more complicated. So let's just take Germany as an example. Germany has a defined territory. Germany has its own government. But is Germany truly a sovereign state? Is it not subject to the rules, the requirements, the regulations, the obligations of various international organizations? It might be NATO or the UN or the EU and many more besides. And is Germany also not highly dependent on other states for its very survival? For example, as recently as 2022, 98% of the oil and 95% of the natural gas that is used in Germany, that is consumed in Germany, is imported from outside of its borders. Now, if you add into all that the fact that the German government cannot act as it sees fit whenever it chooses because of the will of its own people or the reactions from the international community, regardless of whether or not Germany was to withdraw from various organizations, the rest of the world has an opinion and is able to take action if they do not approve of what Germany does. And this is what I'm trying to get at. Sovereignty, the question of sovereignty, the question of what makes a nation or a state sovereign is not black and white. Now, for our part, Stomaria doesn't go around proclaiming itself to be a sovereign state, because no matter how you stretch the definition, the term just simply does not apply to us. But what we are doing is striving for sovereignty by attaining greater levels of self-sufficiency and self-determination through legal and legitimate means. If we find ourselves in the years to come with many square kilometers of land on which hundreds or thousands of people are living and working, and where we are eating our own food, drinking our own water, using our own energy, producing our own goods, establishing our own identity, utilizing our own money, and more besides, we would have attained a greater level of sovereignty than many other entities out there, and trying to attain this de facto independence is what we are striving for. Sovereignty in a practical sense, if not a legitimate sense, in the eyes of the wider world. And as far as I'm concerned, if a nation, if a state is not at least striving for self-sufficiency, then it cannot truly be considered sovereign. To have food security, water security, energy security, and more besides, not resting in the hands of the government of that nation, of that state, but instead being reliant on others, being dependent on others to give you those guarantees. That is not a recipe for true independence and true sovereignty from my perspective. And it doesn't matter how populous that nation might be. It doesn't matter how theoretically powerful that nation is. It doesn't matter how old that nation is. If it is reliant on others, if it is dependent on others, then it cannot truly be considered sovereign in its own right. And something else to consider when we discuss the question of sovereignty that a lot of people seem to get confused about is that you do not need other nations and other states to recognize your sovereignty in order to be sovereign. So if you look at the United Nations, for example, you might assume that every nation within that organization recognizes every other nation as sovereign. But that is simply not the case. For example, you have a dozen nations that do not recognize the People's Republic of China as sovereign. Equally, you have 180 nations that do not recognize the Republic of China as sovereign, which is also called Taiwan for those who might be confused about that. Also, you have 28 nations that do not recognize Israel as sovereign. Pakistan does not recognize Armenia as sovereign. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea does not recognize the Republic of Korea as sovereign, and vice versa, and on it goes. There are many nations, many states, which are considered sovereign by some, but not by others. And that is what I'm trying to get at. This is what I'm trying to get people to understand. Sovereignty is not straightforward. It is not black and white. It is messy. And just because one or more entities, one or more states does not recognize another, does not stop the ones that it doesn't recognize as being sovereign from being sovereign. That is to say, they will function like any other state. Just because someone else doesn't recognize that doesn't make it a reality, doesn't make it something that is practically done in the real world. And that is something that's important from our perspective. Now, is Stomaria going to be recognized as a sovereign state in its own right in my lifetime? No, that is very unlikely to happen. But will I nevertheless work towards striving for that sovereignty, to improve the lives of my family and my community, to live by the values that we hold dear, to keep pushing for self-sufficiency and self-determination so that we might live in a de facto independence, a de facto sovereignty, in a practical, real sense? Absolutely. And that is what we are striving for. That is what we are doing. And a lot of people can see this. And it is great to see the amount of people, the amount of support grows with each week, with each month, with each year, because they can understand what we are trying to do and how important it is, not just for us, but to everyone involved within Stomaria and the wider empire. We have a vision, we have a path forward, and this is not going to be weeks, months, years, or even decades. This is a generational nation-building project, and this is going to be important for a great many people going forward. If you want to learn more about Stomaria or play an active role in our development and expansion, visit our website at www.stomaria.com and find out what it means to be a Stomarian.